island states in the Indian Ocean or throughout the world, the Republic of Mauritius is particularly exposed and therefore vulnerable to natural disasters and extreme weather events, including tropical cyclones, storm surges, torrential rains and flash floods, or even droughts, which are already and will be, for most of them, aggravated by climate change, both in their intensity and frequency. For example, recent observations made by the Mauritian Meteorological Services and published on their website show that the dry season tends to last longer, which results in a stronger pressure on available water resources, and while the number of rainy days seems to decrease overall, heavy rainfall events during the summer months of February and March are more frequent. Likewise, although the total number of storms and cyclones between 1975 and 2008 has not increased, the data analysis shows a trend of intensification of storms reaching the strength of tropical cyclone with winds greater than 165 kilometers per hour. Apart from climate change, risks can also be increased due to rapid and unplanned urbanization, the development of the tourism industry in coastal areas where environmental assessments have not been diligently done, and the conversion of agricultural land or wetlands to commercial use. Indeed, higher concentration of people, goods and infrastructure in risk areas such as lowlands exposed to potential flooding, coastal areas where marine submersion or coastal erosion can happen, and even slopes, which can cause mud flows and landslides, can also lead to greater losses and damages. Faced to this observation and the increasingly systemic and cross-border nature of the risks, whether of natural or technological origin, the current health crisis due to coronavirus in the world and its economic ramifications for Mauritius, as well as the oil spill due to the grounding of the Wakashio, are perfect examples of both these risks. The Republic of Mauritius, via its National Disaster Risk Prediction and Management Center, updated its national policy, strategic framework, and its action plan in terms of disaster risk prediction and management, with the support of the adaptation facility and the DAI experts. The main objective of this support, as well as other projects financed by France through AFD, was to enable the NDRRMC to fully play its role as a cross-sectoral and cross-agency institution whose mission is to, first, reduce and prevent risk by alerting on the occurrence of catastrophes linked with the MMS climate and weather forecasts. In that sense, the adaptation facility also financed the BRIO project, which stands for Building Resilience in the Indian Ocean, in cooperation with the Indian Ocean Commission. This research program will provide high-resolution climate projections for various hazards, such as rise in temperature, change in weather patterns, including precipitation and cyclonic activity, in our ocean basin, and more specifically for Mauritius, with a resolution of up to 4 kilometers. Second, protect because better early warning and alert mechanisms allow for better preparation for disasters before they occur and swift responses when they do. Third, help recover and build back better to be more resilient in the face of future disasters, which we know will be exacerbated by climate change, by mainstreaming disaster risk prediction in the other ministries' policies, advocating for better infrastructure, and seeking disaster risk prediction related funding. It is through this third goal that the link between disaster risk prediction and adaptation to climate change is the clearest, as it allows us collectively to learn from past disasters, assess the vulnerability of our systems, may they be human, socioeconomic, or natural to this risk, and propose solutions to decrease the identified vulnerability while ensuring we can still enjoy the benefits provided to us by these systems. In that sense, the government of Mauritius signed with AFD on July 27th a loan of 300 million euros to deal with the COVID crisis and its economic consequences. As this loan was initially planned to be triggered when a disaster occurred, a grant envelope of 1.5 million euros was adjoined to the loan in order to support 4 sectors. The health sector, by strengthening and upgrading the surveillance system and the One Health approach to help Mauritius equip itself with the best alert management and response mechanisms. It is also to align the Mauritius health system with the international sanitary regulation developed by the WHO. The social protection sector, by establishing a gradual crisis exit strategy, strengthening protection systems, social assistance and capacities. The dialogue will also be initiated on gender inequalities and their impact on the economy. Third, the climate change and disaster risk prediction sectors, by supporting the evolution of the environmental assessment system to include vulnerabilities to climate change and the operationalization of the climate change bill. And fourth, the public finance sector, by supporting the establishment of the Office of Research and Economic Planning, and the Ministry of Finance will acquire the capacity for analyzing public policies and planning investments sensitive to climate change and disaster risks. AFD being the first development agency whose interventions and funding are 100% aligned with the Paris Agreement on Climate, we wish to facilitate the dialogue on public policies through loans or grants in order to ensure they take into account the impact of climate change and the need to preserve and protect our environment and our livelihoods. We can intervene with economic actors, may they be banks, companies, or local governments, and at the level of citizens to raise their awareness on subject matters of great importance for the Republic. Therefore, the AFD remains at the disposal of the government of Mauritius, and notably the Ministry of Local Government and Disaster Risk Management, to further support the implementation of the priority measures developed within the NDRRM action plan, and which I believe will be discussed during today's workshop. The action plan, along with the NDRRM National Policy and Strategic Framework, will guide the approach of the Republic of Mauritius in disaster risk reduction and management for the next 10 years until 2030. I am very glad, in the name of AFD, to officially deliver these documents to you, Honorable Vice Prime Minister Mr. Hasno and Mr. Anil Kumardi. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to extend to you all a very warm welcome for the launch ceremony of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Policy, Strategic Framework and Action Plan. As you are aware, 2020 has been a tough and challenging year, especially with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Wakashu incident, which has severely impacted on the economic activities of Mauritius. Hence, the need for Mauritius to be more than ever prepared to face a range of hazards, ranging from the local challenges to global concern. It could not be a better time for us to launch the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Policy, Strategic Framework and Action Plan. Ladies and gentlemen, the Policy, Strategic Framework and Action Plan are inspired by the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 and the African Union Programme of Action for the implementation of the Sendai Framework for the disaster risk reduction 2015 to 2030 in Africa. The document also supports implementation of the Mauritius Vision 2030, and inter alia, the Sustainable Development Goals, the intended nationally determined contribution for the Republic of Mauritius, and the Paris Agreement, and the SID accelerated modalities of action that is a somewhat powerful. This project covers the first phase of an overall support package under the Agence Française de Développement, Adapt and Action Facility. The contract for undertaking this project was awarded to the consultancy firm DIE, and it is a pleasure to have among us today Mr. Kelly and Mrs. Pascal from DIET. Once again, I wish to seize this opportunity to thank them for their unflinching support towards the completion of this project. I would also like to place on record the very strong support and collaboration provided by Agence Française de Développement, whereby Mauritius has benefited from several important projects, as has just been mentioned. And here today, namely the capacity building for the first responders amongst others. Another important national project is the operational study of the coastal risk for the islands of the Republic of Mauritius, that is the coastal erosion and marine flooding, which will be implemented in the near future. On behalf of the government of Mauritius and my ministry, I wish to thank the Agence Française de Développement for their continuous support and collaboration in the field of disaster risk reduction and management. Ladies and gentlemen, the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Policy, Strategic Framework, and Action Plan will guide and harmonize our approach to disaster risk reduction and management for the next decade, that is until 2030, while ensuring the flexibility to adapt to an ever-changing and unpredictable environment. The disaster risk reduction management policy statement is that disaster impact should be proactively reduced to the lowest level possible with available local and external resources. That's our statement, the policy statement. The strategic framework will guide the effort by the government of Mauritius, the communities, civil society, development partners, the private sector to reduce disaster risk and improve the management of disasters. The National Strategic Framework defines 4 strategic objectives. Firstly, disaster risk governance, ensures that risk governance systems are enabled to face current and future disaster risks. Secondly, disaster risk reduction, that is, to reduce disaster risk during the decade 2030, as I just mentioned. Thirdly, a warning and alert system to have in operation a multi-hazard, impact-based warning system with effective means of alert by 2030. And obviously, preparedness and response recovery. The action plan includes details on the action to be taken. And who is going to be the lead authority, that is the ministry responsible for each action, who are the parties who will be involved for each action, the estimated cost, the timeline in years during which the action is to be completed, and the indicators for each and every action. The action plan will ensure comprehensive whole-of-government approach and mainstream disaster risk reduction, management initiative horizontally across the ministries and vertically across different governance levels. However, this will not engage government law, but will ensure that civil society and development partners are fully engaged as well. Whilst national and local disaster risk reduction strategies are essential elements of any functioning disaster risk governance system, the ultimate value lies in their proper implementation. I hope that all the stakeholders will be firmly focused on plans that are pushing the boundaries here in our context, that is Mauritius, and at the same time are realistically aligned with our existing means and capabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, the successful implementation of the action contained in this document will not be possible without the continued collaboration of everyone. My appeal to you is that while we must continue joining hands together toward making things happen, thus adopting the approach of words into action, as advocated by the Sendai framework. We look forward to working with all the stakeholders, including the civil society and the development partners, to ensure a more resilient Republic of Mauritius by 2030. I would also like to recognize and thank the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Center for leading the development of this policy, strategic framework, and action plan, as well as all the key stakeholders who devoted time and effort to its development. With this word, ladies and gentlemen, I now have the pleasure to launch the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Policy, Strategic Framework, and Action Plan.
Well, we worked out the technical issues. Let me explain a little bit about the background. As you know, Mauritius is subject to disasters. Of course, we've had, over the years, different kinds of disasters. So we're very aware of the flooding that took place quite recently, quite nearby here. Very dramatic situation. And of course, the government was very good at responding to that by making the area safer and also very much engaging in the issue of flood risk management. So that's a very good aspect. But I was looking back at some of the history of Mauritius, and 1893, I think there was a fire in Mauritius, downtown here, that burned down a good part of the city. And if we think about the economic impact of that kind of event, if something like that, well, that scale would be to happen today, the impact on Mauritius would be dramatic. We think COVID is bad, but this would obviously be something much worse. And so one of the aspects we came into when we looked at the policy and developing the framework and the action plan is not just on the disasters that we've had recently, but also trying to look back in the history and see what kinds of disasters have happened in the past. And again, what kind of hazards and disasters we might look to in the future. Next slide, please. High tech here. Oh, sorry. Okay. DAI, Honorable Minister and Representative AFD explained a little bit about DAI. There's myself, Veronique, and Rachel. Unfortunately, I must mention that Rachel couldn't come because she's in the UK, and the COVID situation was such that she couldn't make it. But she really wanted to be here. Next slide, please. So I just mentioned the history. We've already talked about the Sendai framework. And we've talked about the African Union Program of Action. It was very important. So you have the flooding, you have the lower right there, the picture of the fires that burned downtown Port Louis, and dramatic pictures, very dramatic pictures. Something we'd have a hard time to imagining today. And then also, the Rakashoi was not the first time recently that a ship ran into Mauritius. Luckily, this ship was gotten off the reef. There was no pollution, although the ship actually did sink later on, but it didn't affect Mauritius as badly. But these are the kinds of things we want to look at in terms of the hazards and what we built the policy around, the framework around, and the action plan around. What has happened recently, the flooding, which is obviously a big issue for Mauritius, what's happened a long time ago in the past, and things that might be happening again in the future. Next slide, please. So, as was explained, this is the third component of 3 different components under the Adap Action facility. It's the component looking at, the overall project looks at enhancing resilience to climate change, which is the ER2C project. And what we've been working on, Rachel and Veronique and myself, is component 3. We've been working on this for about 2.5 years now. That's not because we wanted to make it long, but we had other things happen. And so what we've been working with is the NDRMC, the Ministry of Local Government and Disaster Risk Management, and we've been focusing on how to implement an element of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act. Now, the act is actually very forward-looking and was done in 2016 and really incorporates a lot of things that we would expect to be happening now in a country like Mauritius. But one of the elements of that was a requirement for a policy, a strategic framework, and an action plan. And this project has put those things to action. Next slide, please. Good. Okay, so the development of this has been a sort of a lengthy process because of other factors. Of course, COVID, the orchestra delayed things. But what we wanted to do was have a comprehensive understanding of risks facing Mauritius. So we looked at technological risks and anthropogenic risks, and natural risks, trying to look at all sorts of different things. Now, when you get a copy of the document, you will see almost 2 pages, 40 some I think it is, different hazards that could affect the country. Now, some of them are very small, tsunami maybe, earthquakes maybe, but we also wanted to look at things like volcanic eruption. How could that affect Mauritius? Well, if you fly from Paris here, you fly over a zone with several active volcanoes, not to say anything of our neighboring island. And as we found with Iceland, when a volcano erupts far away, it could affect air traffic quite close to where you are. So the volcano in Iceland erupted and it affected air traffic all throughout Western Europe. The same thing could happen to Mauritius. So we want to bring in these things that may seem to be very unlikely hazards, but ones that we identify so that we can prepare for them and figure out how best they can be dealt with. This was a collaborative approach. We were looking at the whole of government effort and also trying to reach out to other parties, the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, and other parties to try to bring in as much information and effort as possible to concentrate that. I also want to acknowledge that we worked with the Cadre project, or the Cadre effort, which was supported by the United Nations, which was doing a very similar effort, but more looked at certain aspects of disaster response and preparedness and management. And we brought that into our effort and into the action plan. So I have the whole effort of identifying hazards, identifying vulnerability, and reducing risk. And Mauritius, as a country that's transitioning into quote unquote high development, it's a small difference in GMP there, but it's transitioning in many aspects of social and economic aspects into different ways that people are vulnerable. Okay, and we've seen that now with the COVID situation, that people become vulnerable for reasons that you might not see immediately. For instance, a family is dependent on somebody on a ship, on a cruise ship, to send back money to support them. And while the cruise business is doing well, everybody's okay. But then all of a sudden, that person on the cruise ship can't leave the ship for a year, 6 months, and they may not be getting any pay. And then that creates another problem. So I don't want to make this sound very complicated, but Mauritius is, like many island states, a situation where you have to start thinking about the third or fourth impact of an event. Mauritius sailors on a ship where the owner abandons the ship, then it becomes very complicated. This not only affects the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Center, it affects the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it affects the Prime Minister's office, it affects all sorts of different parts of the government. And so what we've tried to do is bring all these things together into one approach. Next slide, please. So we have the policy, and as the minister pointed out, the policy statement, disaster impact should be proactively reduced to the lowest level possible with the available resources. Now we recognize that there is a level where you could get to in theory, but it's not realistic to try to get there because we're just not going to have the resources available. We can't spend $1 billion or $1 trillion like the United States spends on certain things. We have to be realistic about what we can do. That requires we make choices, and that's what the action plan is about. What are the best choices we can make in terms of reducing risk? And then the policy, which is relatively short, frankly, it's only part of the document there. We look at all the multiple risks and hazards, and everyone, not just the government, but everybody in the country is expected to take a responsibility for disaster risk reduction. Now, this is not necessarily a new approach, but something that's been given vigor from the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It's not that the government should do everything, it's that everybody should do something to reduce risk and deal with disasters. So if you live in a place that floods, you shouldn't rely just on the government to come and help you. You should also take measures yourself to reduce that risk from flooding. And this is a concept that's becoming very prevalent internationally and something that I think Mauritius can work with. Next slide, please. So when we turn to the strategic framework, you'll notice we have colors here that help you code which document is which. So within that document, there's an extensive discussion of the different hazards, different vulnerabilities, and different risks which exist within the country. Some very good graphics. When you look at the document, it's actually very attractive. It provides all the legal basis and the background for doing the work that's being done. It's based on 5 pillars, which have been mentioned, but I'll touch on them again. Understanding risk, strengthening disaster risk governance, investing in risk reduction, enhancing preparedness, and strengthening capacities. Now, the disaster risk governance is sort of a new concept that's come forward, emphasizing the fact that it's the governance system within a country that actually is important to reduce risk. So it's not just the National Disaster Risk Reduction Center or the ministry that is supposed to reduce risk. It entails the whole governance system, whether it be enacting laws, regulations, implementing those laws and regulations, following up on them, engaging the citizen, this whole process of governance. So this is like something that's really being brought into this document. Next slide, please. There are 4 interlinked goals: increase ability to manage risk, reduce current levels of risk as low as reasonably possible, avoid the creation of new risk. This is one of the challenges we face as a country develops, is that you got that problem dealt with, and all of a sudden there's a new problem that comes up. And so the anticipatory nature, particularly with a 10-year horizon on the action plan, to try to anticipate and look forward to see what are the new problems that might be coming up, how are risks changing, vulnerabilities changing, and how can the government work with the people of the country to move forward in those areas. And then ensure preparedness, warning, response, recovery are effective as efficient as possible. What we do find, and again, I don't want to make this as a special case for Mauritius because it's global, is that there's a lot of attention on disaster response, saving people. Okay, and then all of a sudden you realize that they have to rebuild their houses, fix the water supply, get them jobs, and all these other kinds of things. And that's where that can take 2 to 5 years sometimes. A normal World Bank, for instance, loan for recovery can take 5 years. So we need to also start thinking about that recovery process as part of the initial response so that we can get it going as quickly as possible and get it ended as quickly as possible, get people back to their normal situation. So these are some of the ideas that have been brought into the strategy, into the strategic framework. Next slide, please. The minister already touched on this. The Risk Reduction Act, Vision 2030, a number of other things. You can see these. One thing I want to point out was mentioned the international health regulations. This is something that was existing before COVID-19, but has become much more important during COVID-19 and places burdens on the government and the country in terms of dealing with reporting on health issues and responding to health issues. One of the things that we see sometimes is that health response is not necessarily tied to the other capacities within the country to respond to disasters. And that's a point, isn't it? The Agenda for Humanity, I wanted to mention, because this comes out of an effort several years ago by the international community to better coordinate humanitarian immediate response. Mauritius, in the last decade or so, hasn't gotten that much international response to disasters, teams flying in and things like that, except when the ship ran aground. And then all of a sudden you had groups showing up from different places to do different kinds of things. And it was in the middle of the Waukesha, middle of the pandemic, so it even got more and more complicated. So one of the things about the Agenda for Humanity in terms of response is better coordinating that international assistance, having agreements with other countries so they can provide assistance, making sure that doctors who come are certified to function in Mauritius rather than not being approved. And these are all issues that we've identified over time. Again, it's a process of improving the results. And then also the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Next slide, please. So now I'll turn to the action plan. I must say, I apologize, the color doesn't look as good as it does in here. But the action plan is based on 4 objectives which are taken from the national strategy. So these are set in the national strategy. Risk governance, risk reduction, warning and alert, response and recovery. Now again, I emphasize that risk governance is here because it's the governance system that really makes these other things work well. Mauritius is already doing quite a lot on risk reduction with the LDA and other efforts on the coastal zones to try to reduce risks. But we want to look at the overall system for doing that. And there's some interesting discussions that have taken place already about how to make the tourism sector more resilient and better able to deal with the different kinds of hazards that we now have and how they might evolve with climate change. Warning and alert. Mauritius is actually pretty well advanced in many aspects of warning and alert. And so There's actually not that many actions we need to take there, as it turns out, but it's good. And then response and recovery. And as I said, the whole point here is to be prepared not only for the immediate life-saving response, but also for the recovery process, which might take 3 to 5 years. Next slide, please. Good. Here's the scary number. 189 actions. It was almost 200, but we then went back and recounted them. Anyway, this actually is good because there's a lot of detail in the actions that take place. Now, when we sit down to reality, we actually would combine a lot of the actions. For instance, putting together a number of elements into a national disaster response plan, for instance, would bring together a number of actions. But the advantage we have is that it's very detailed, and this is thanks a lot to the Cadre project that I mentioned from the UN. And that allows you, to be much more engaged in identifying how to implement those actions over the 10 years. What comes first, what comes second, how to plan out all those kinds of things. The estimated cost in 2020 dollars is about 9.6 million US dollars. That sounds like a big number, but you think about $1 million a year, spread out among 20 or 30 actions. It's not actually that much in individual activities. It's just when you aggregate it, it looks like a big number. And then, as I said, this is a whole of society effort. Rolling implementation, we recognize from earlier efforts at disaster risk reduction planning that you can't have a set plan for 5 years or 10 years. Reality will change. So here we have a rolling implementation. So 2020, 2023, 24 to 27, 28 to 30. And this will allow both the implementation of the actions, adjustment of actions, and changes in funding and priorities to evolve over time as we see new hazards, new risks coming forward and being important. The plan is to monitor annually through the National Disaster Risk Management Center and also the Council, which I haven't mentioned much of, but plays a very important role in overseeing this. And then there's a question that's actually one of the actions is whether Mauritius should establish a National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Platform, which is a broader group than the Council, but these are some of the issues that governance need to tackle. Evaluations in 22, 26, and 29 to inform the next phase. So, how are we going? How's things moving forward? And then the funding of this is actually not really, it's a very important question, but I can't tell you the answer yet. Because when you look at all these actions, some of them may be funded already through development projects. Some of them may not cost anything. Some of them may be relatively expensive. And we recognize that if for a donor project or external funding, it might take a year or 2 years to get a project in line to do things. And that's part of the rolling implementation process, is that we anticipate what's needed, figure out the funding, and figure out where to get those things. By the way, I apologize, I'm saying we because I've really committed to doing this, but next slide. So, in closing, Mauritius is one of the few countries in Africa and globally that has this setup of a risk reduction management policy, strategic framework, and an action plan. These do exist in other countries. I'm not saying nobody else has them. But to have it laid out this way, very clearly and in 3 different parts, this is one of the few countries that has it. Admittedly, a decade is a long time, but there are a lot of things to do. And there's a lot of details about how to do that. And so one of the things we hope is that, I would hope, is that tomorrow you don't forget everything. That you have to realize that there is more work to be done. We have, for 2021, about 60 actions. Actually, we'll combine some of those. We'll talk about this afternoon in the workshop. 60 actions. Some are small and short. Some are big and long. That's just the nature of implementing the risk reduction process. And so in the end, Mauritius now moves from defining what needs to be done to doing what needs to be done. As the minister said, putting words to action. The next slide. So, good luck. Thank you very much.